Chapter 2, North Carolina. Dead-Eye Daniel. When at last Daniel went back to his family, he brought presents and glowing tales of the land he'd seen, particularly the beautiful North Carolina country. It wasn't long before the Boones were on the move once more in 1751 to see it for themselves. Though the family spent their first Carolina winter in a cave, they eventually settled in the Yadkin River Valley near the courthouse town of Salisbury. And Henry Miller? He got rich running the ironworks he began in Virginia. Over the next few years, Daniel did his part in the brutal work of clearing the land, felling trees, grubbing stumps, sod busting, building fences, and shelters had to be done, but farming would never be his cup of sassafras tea. It was money earned from Daniel's hunting and trapping that helped to buy the Boone's land, and it was his skill with a rifle that was making him famous among settlers and natives. The frontier folks' shooting competitions were a popular entertainment. They bet money on their favorites, blasting away at targets as little ones covered their ears. Many a fellow tried and failed to outshoot Dead-Eye Daniel. One contender, a Catawba tribesman known as Saucy Jack, became so jealous of Daniel's marksmanship that he threatened to shoot him. When Mr. Boone heard of this threat on his son, Old Squire roared out his own intentions to kill Saucy Jack, so Mr. S.J. reconsidered and lost himself in the forest. Meanwhile, far across the Atlantic Ocean and off to the north and west, beyond the Ohio River, more complicated troubles were brewing. They'd take young Daniel Boone off on an entirely new adventure, and a mighty dangerous one at that. War in the woods. In the winter of 1751, George Washington, now a young officer in Virginia's militia, and Scout Christopher Gist barely survived a cold, death-defying journey. They went up to Fort Le Boeuf near Lake Erie to warn the French commander there to pull his troops out of their forts in the Alleghenies on land claimed by Great Britain. The French refused. So in the spring, George and a tiny army attacked some of their soldiers not far from Fort Duquesne. France's stronghold on the headwaters of the Ohio, a fine location for a fort, strategy-wise, since this river was a major east-west waterway. 10 French soldiers died, and 21 were taken prisoner, but the French flag still fluttered over Fort Duquesne. George's men needed their own fort, so they hurried to build Fort Necessity, then had to surrender it in July 1754 when the time came for French payback. This marked the beginning of the final French and Indian War. George Washington, without meaning to, had touched off a conflict that spread into Europe, known there as the 7 Years' War, and took about 1 million lives. One man, Horace Walpole, put it like this: "The volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire." French and Indian War? Oh yes. Both the British and French turned the native tribes against one another and the white settlers, unleashing terror on the American frontier. Daniel joined among almost 700 militiamen who marched and rode off to help the British troops, aka regulars or redcoats, secure Great Britain's hold on eastern North America and loosen France's grip on it. The British commander was Major General Edward Braddock, a brave, stubborn expert in European-style warfare. George Washington, who was familiar with the frontier, warned him of the need for stealth and flexibility when going up against Native American warriors. The native peoples mostly sided with the French, who were more interested in furs than land, and tended to treat Indians better than the English did. "The savages may be formidable to your raw American militia," Braddock sneered, "but they wouldn't face the king's disciplined troops." The proud general made his insult to the colonials worse than having them march behind his men. Plenty of them helped to slash brush, chop trees, and bridge streams, making a road for the army and its massive supply train of some 400 wagons. Daniel was at the reins of one of the many teams that strained to haul the force's weapons, officers, and support people. There would be tools, too, as well as blankets, tents, cannonballs, and gunpowder. Flour, candles, bayonets, and all sorts of other equipment. Flags fluttered and snagged in low-hanging branches. Flies buzzed. Sun glinted off bright bits of metal. Soldiers sweated in their highly visible scarlet wool coats as they marched to the trills of fifes and thumping drums. Struggling along behind the grinding, stumbling parade was a dwindling herd of cattle, future lunches and dinners. The whole caravan stretched out more than 5 miles long, 5 miles along Braddock's Road. Day by day, the army inched its way through the Alleghenies. Night by night, campfires flickered on the faces of exhausted men swapping stories. Daniel never forgot those he heard from a wandering Irish merchant, John Findlay. His travels had taken him to a marvelous land down south, west of the Cumberland Mountains. Findlay's eyes glowed as he talked about clear streams flowing, lofty forests growing out of black, velvety soil, and most of all, there were multitudes of deer, bears, beavers, and bison to be harvested in Kentucky, Iroquois for meadowlands. Lots of frontier folk called it Kaintuck, or later, when so many fought so hard for it, the dark and bloody ground. Tales of this paradise lit a long burning fire in restless Daniel's imagination. He didn't know when or how, but someday he'd go to Kentucky. General Braddock was determined to drive the French out of Fort Duquesne, but he never got the chance. On the steep banks of the Monongahela River on July 9, 1755, hundreds of Ottawa, Huron, Delaware, and Shawnee warriors and their French allies swooped down on the redcoats. As bullets and arrows cracked and whirred, Braddock and his officers shouted their troops into position. Daniel and the others backed down the trail, saw the smoke, and heard the gunfire and war cries. A stunning victory it was for the French and the Indians. For Braddock and the others who were killed, it was a confusing catastrophe. When soldiers saw their comrades being scalped, many panicked and ran, according to George Washington, as sheep pursued by dogs. Still, when you consider what happened to those who were taken prisoner by native warriors, stripped of their crimson coats, tormented and burned to death, running was, if not noble, the sensible choice. Young Daniel Boone cut the terrified animals loose from his wagon, and away on horseback he fled for his life. As for General Braddock, who learned the hard way about war in the woods, his body was buried, hidden from harm, under Braddock's Road. The French and Indian War, 7 Years' War. In Paris, there were plenty of fashionably wigged officials who felt that France was entitled to the land around the Great Lakes and all of Louisiana territory, too. Why? Because as far back as 1603, Frenchmen such as Sieur de la Salle and Samuel de Champlain had explored on and around the waters in these lands, which were, not incidentally, well populated with beavers, whose glossy pelts were very valuable. In London, lots of folks thought that Great Britain should control all the land west of their 13 colonies. These ideas, plus European wrangles over royal power, were behind a whole lot of trouble known in America as the French and Indian Wars. The last one was the most important history-wise because 1, it decided the fate of eastern North America, and 2, it set the scene for the next big thing, the American Revolution. How? By totally changing the way British colonists and their royal government thought of each other. Daniel and Rebecca. When Daniel returned to the Yadkin Valley, he began keeping company with a dark-haired girl he'd met at the wedding of one of his sisters. On August 14, 1758, 21-year-old Daniel married Rebecca Bryan, 17. After a ceremony conducted by Squire Boone, father of the groom and local justice of the peace, a big noisy party lasted far into the night. Somewhere in the middle of their merrymaking, their laughing, giggling friends bid the blushing newlyweds good night. Daniel farmed and worked as a blacksmith, making sparks fly from his hammer and anvil. For a while there, the young husband settled himself down with his bride and later on baby James, born in the spring of 1757. By the time James' little brother Israel was born in early 1759, big changes had happened far off in western Pennsylvania. In late 1758, men led by Brigadier General John Forbes had built another rough, horrid road leading to a second, this time successful, attack on Fort Duquesne, or rather its smoking remains. Instead of surrendering their stronghold to the British, the French burned it. Soon men were building thick new walls for another fort, this one to be named after the Prime Minister of Great Britain. William Pitt's name is the big city that's there nowadays too, Pittsburgh. The French and Indian War would not officially end until 1763, but anyone seeing the British flag atop Fort Pitt would know that the days of France's power over the Ohio River Valley were over. Frontier on fire. Daniel's young family and their North Carolina neighbors faced a whole lot more trouble. The Cherokee and the Shawnee were on the warpath, and they weren't the only ones. The native peoples were desperate over more and more white settlers coming west every spring, along with their axes, plows, rifles, scaring away the animals, and field by cleared field destroying the forest. All up and down through the colonial wilderness, Daniel and Rebecca and others like them were on the alert, hushing their little ones and hardly daring to light a candle after dark. If you lived back there and then, you might have awakened any night to smoke and flames and intruders, prepared to kidnap or kill you. By many a fireplace, folks shuddered over the story of Mary Ingalls, a 23-year-old pioneer wife who was taken by the Shawnee Raiders in 1755 in present-day West Virginia. The tale of her escape and her harrowing, miserable trek through the wilds back to her own people became of oft-told real-life legend. It wasn't necessarily fatal, but the As for scalping, whites as well as natives were known to do that. It wasn't necessarily fatal, but the horror of having your skin slashed from the top of your head, hair still attached, was the stuff of nightmares. Sad to say, but brutal history taught generations of all kinds of people to believe that the only good, enter the name of the enemy, was a dead person. A tap of the window, any word that attackers were on the way, sent settlers scurrying to fort up, herd animals to the nearest stockade. Lots of folks moved back east to safety. That's what the Boone family did in 1759 when they went to Virginia. To provide for his family, Daniel framed a bit and did some target shooting. He hunted too, but in more settled, civilized Virginia, there was little game to shoot, so he drove wagons full of his neighbors' tobacco to sell in Fredericksburg. George Washington often had business in that town, home of his notoriously crabby mom. He'd retired from the military, temporarily, as we know, up here in the far-off future, and he did not. Why? It wasn't that, as a soldier, he'd nearly drowned, almost died of fever, and barely missed by flying bullets. No. What infuriated George was the way colonial soldiers were paid and respected less than in Britain's regular armed forces. It was this sort of unequal treatment that was beginning to make colonists think of themselves as Americans instead of subjects of the British Empire. And this is George Washington and Daniel Boone. George probably didn't notice Daniel, backcountry wagon wrangler, when they both served in General Braddock's failed campaign, but it's very likely that these two historical superstars-to-be exchanged greetings in Fredericksburg. Then the tall, rather formal Virginian and the rough-clad woodsman went their very separate ways. George to his Potomac River plantation, Daniel to his cabin, but not for long. Once he made sure that Rebecca, their boys, and new baby, Susanna, would be safe and looked after, restless Daniel went hunting. Dangerous though it may be, the frontier was where he was best able to make a living with his rifle and traps. He always went away, tramping through the tangled, majestic, stone-silent wilderness, and he always came back home, then away again, to adventure and distant places. The Long Hunter. If you flew back in time, you'd see lean, tough Daniel rambling over the Appalachian ranges, ridges, and river valleys to what is now eastern Tennessee. With him might well be a dog sniffing and questing and a pack horse. Always Daniel's eyes were peeled for signs of anyone or anything passing through the woods. Always his ears were open for the sound of an Indian signal that only sounded like a bird call. Imagine leaves rustling, twigs snapping, footfalls crunching, and Daniel's powder and ball already rammed down Ticklicker's barrel. Now he lifts rifle to shoulder and kerblast! Down goes a bear, and soon Daniel's standing by its still warm carcass. He pulls a bright, sharp knife from its sheath and begins carving letters into the pale bark of a beech tree. For years to come, anyone passing that way might read what happened here. D. Boone killed a bar on tree in the year 1760. Throughout his life, Daniel scattered woodland messengers about his exploits, or to let fellow travelers know that fresh water was nearby. His spelling was lousy, But his meaning was clear. Restless Daniel Boone sold his peltry back east, moved his growing family to their old Carolina cabin, and helped his neighbors fight off Indian attacks. The Boones moved 3 more times, always a little farther west and deeper into the hills, until settling near present-day Wilkesboro in western North Carolina, but not quite to Kentucky. Not yet. Daniel rambled, sometimes solitary, sometimes with other long hunters, such as his brother Squire and John Stewart, husband of their kid sister Hannah. One hunt took them as far south as Pensacola Bay, into the land of alligators, pelicans, and Seminole Indians. Daniel was so intrigued by Florida that he wanted to bring his wife and kids there to live. But no. To such a distant place, Rebecca was not prepared to go. Another time, he and Squire followed rivers and bison trails west into the Cumberland Mountains until Daniel knew they were close to the game-filled meadows old John Finley had talked about so long ago. There had to be a way in, some passage in this fierce, overgrown landscape. But where? Daniel and his brother turned back, not realizing that they'd actually reached the eastern edges of present-day Kentucky, but they hadn't gotten to its grassy heart. Not yet. All the while, Daniel acquainted himself with the Appalachian wilds, the people there, and they with him, the man who roamed their lands, the keen-eyed man with the wide, thin-lipped smile. One night, Daniel was awakened from a sound sleep by a man grinning down at him. "Ah, wide mouth, have I caught you now?" Quick-thinking Daniel roused himself up and greeted a small band of Cherokees with smiles, offers of venison, deer meat, and a good-natured exchange of wilderness news before managing his escape. When his firstborn James was old enough, Daniel took him hunting and began showing him woodland ways. Imagine them on a freezing winter night, 7-year-old James curled against his father's chest, Daniel's buckskin coat wrapped around them both. Their feet are by the campfire. Father and son are blanketed with snow, sleeping soundly. Rebellion and regulators. Fly on over America's eastern forests in the 1760s, and you'd see smoke curling up through the thick tree canopy from cabins and crops put to the torch. You'd hear drums, gunshots, and cries coming from the troubles between settlers, soldiers, and native folk. Swoop down lower, and you'd hear talk of Pontiac, an Ottawa war leader who was whipping up a multi-tribe army to reclaim their traditional customs and lands. Along the shores of the Great Lakes, hundreds of Ojibwa, Ottawa, Huron, and Delaware warriors seized and besieged British forts. A successful, fearful campaign it was, until the effort fizzled out in 1763. Don't be thinking that the only troubles were between Indians and colonists. In the rough 1760s in the Carolina frontier, there was plenty of plain old criminal behavior, and worse, some folks who'd been robbed or had kinfolks kidnapped found that their local authorities, representatives of the crown, remember in these pre-revolutionary times, were more interested in taking bribes than in enforcing the law and keeping the peace. Plenty of citizens got so frustrated that they took matters into their own hands, invading courthouses, beating up sheriffs and judges. They called themselves regulators. Was Daniel a regulator? No. Generally, he'd just as soon not be involved in political doings. When a well-known lawyer and judge, Richard Henderson, had his home and crops burned by regulators, Daniel sided with the judge. After all, he'd helped more than once when Daniel was sued for not being able to pay his bills. Eventually, in 1771, government forces crushed the regulators, but plenty of frontier folks would remember, when the American Rebellion broke out in 1775, that official power could be attacked and undone. And there'd be some who didn't like that Daniel Boone had sided with the suits established authority. The decade of the 1760s began with the crowning of a new British king. George III was in charge of Great Britain, his ancestral bit of Germany, the West Indies, some of Africa, India, and vast swaths of North America, home of the flaming frontier. His Majesty decided to send an army to protect the American colonists. Of course, they'd have to pay some extra taxes to pay for costly forts and soldiers. This would lead to trouble. And to calm down the warring tribes, the king proclaimed that as of 1763, with the end of the French and Indian War, the lands of the Allegheny Mountains should be for Indians and animals and not for colonial settlers. A fine idea, but no king could stop what was happening in North America. Daniel Boone wasn't the only one whose imagination pointed west. Since the 1740s, adventurers had been surveying the wild Ohio Valley. Both George Washington and Benjamin Franklin had visions of wealth from land out there. And think of this. When Daniel's grandpa came over in 1717, almost 500,000 people lived in the British colonies. By 1740, when Daniel was 6, there were nearly 1 million. Double that by 1763, and you can see that mountains and royal decrees were never going to hold back floods of land-lusting people. And ruling the American colonies from the far side of the Atlantic Ocean was rapidly growing more difficult. Pressure was building. Big changes were coming. One autumn day in 1768, a man showed up at Daniel's cabin. John Finley, he was, whom Daniel hadn't seen since the days of Braddock's Road. It wasn't long before the old trader, 49, and the young hunter, 34, were beside a flickering fire, once again talking about cane tuck. Now Daniel's wife sat listening too, holding new baby Rebecca. There'd be wide-eyed James, 11, Israel, 10, Susanna, 8, Jemima, 6, and Lavinia, 2. John Stewart and young Squire Boone came to listen too, and pepper the peddler with questions about Kentucky. To get there, they'd have to find the warrior's path that threaded through the dense wilderness. The Cherokees and Shawnees had long used this shadowy trail to attack one another or to raid settlers' farms and hamlets. Whoever found and followed the path would come to a place that Finley knew of. Wasioto, the Indians called it, a gap in the Cumberland Mountains. Beyond it lay Kentucky. It'd be a difficult journey, but if an experienced frontier scout, Daniel for instance, went along, and if someone would finance the trip, not broke in debt Daniel, and if they were careful and lucky, a party of trappers would return with enough skins and pelts to make themselves very, very rich. Daniel's eyes must have been two blue flames. He went to see Judge Henderson, who badly wanted to begin a settlement, a little frontier empire of his own, west of the mountains, just as soon as he could find a legal way around the king's proclamation. The judge hired Daniel to scout out Kentucky and financed an exploration/hunting trip combo. So it was that on May 1st, 1769, John Finley, John Stewart, and a trio of neighbors headed out. At the head of the group was Daniel, all abuzz to see Kentucky at last, the hunter's paradise of his dreams. Squire would tend the crops, then go off to join the hunters. Now he and Hannah Stewart, 21, waved to their big brother Daniel and to her husband John. Rebecca Boone, her kin, and her neighbors bid their farewells. Running along and behind the hunters were assorted children until their mothers called them back. When or if they'd ever see their menfolk again, no one could tell.